get started. I'd probably like to start. I mean, hadn't indicated this in the set of questions that probably were shared. Interesting topic about the annual session. So let's start with that. Living with volatility, survival, revival, and growth. Very, very well laid out, actually. How is the mood currently in the autocom fraternity? And obviously, sales have been picking up since June, some green shoots. How is the mood in the industry?
Well, first and foremost, let me tell you, I haven't had the chance to look at what your questions or layoff had been, but I think I'm just going to try and go pretty much with the flow, and we try and be as candid as possible.
Perfect.
So you said, what's the mood of the industry? I think, we've been saying it for a long time. We're optimistic, but we're cautiously optimistic.
Right.
And obviously the caution comes in because of the whole nature of this industry and the ecosystem being so volatile, right? And I think, you've got, as I think even the PwC report said that, I think concurrently, we're actually doing all the three things together, right? We are surviving, we're looking at opportunities to grow, we're also reviving ourselves. So I think this has been going on for a while now. And I think in the immediate future, it will continue these aspects. But I think there is also a lot of optimism because there are multiple opportunities, right, which the whole environment, for especially the component sector. I think you heard the policymakers speak today, the ministers speak today. Clearly, I think a lot of forward messaging was done in terms of, I would say transitioning to the new era of technologies. Yesterday also, there was the ACMA conference where there was on the technology advancements, mainly on hydrogen and this thing. So although we are aware of the current challenges which the industry is facing, but I think there is a lot of optimism that the future would actually be maybe more disruptive, but with disruptions, there were a lot of opportunities for.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful, right. And I think, as you indicated, there's a lot of emphasis on alternate fuel technology as well. I think that's something we've been talking about. We'll probably come to that. Obviously, EVs are leading the way. Before going to that, last financial year, obviously, the autocom industry degrew, albeit by a small figure. How does the rest of the current financial year look like, Deepak? And what is the outlook, your outlook for the rest of the financial year? And let's do this with the assumption that we're not going to have a very severe third wave of COVID, because I think that's going to be very, very important.
First and foremost, thank you for making that assumption. We actually also started with this assumption prior to basically, let's say in January, February, when we were actually, trying to come to a closure of a pretty, I would say, dismal last year, financial year. We were very optimistic that we actually have a high double-digit growth, right, in this financial year. And unfortunately, that assumption was very wrong because we were hit with the second wave. And I think clearly, let's talk about pre-COVID 2.0.
Right.
Pre-COVID 2.0, the industry was actually looking at probably double-digit, mid-teens or higher teens growth. We are looking at even 15 to 20% growth. Although, I mean, again, it's on a lower base, right? The industry declined 14%, but you're looking at about 20%. Still not to the peak of 18, 19, because in 2 years, you've actually kind of degrew almost 27, 28%. But when you're looking at a maybe 15 to 20% growth, you're saying that you've largely covered good ground.
Right.
But then this whole COVID 2.0 happened. And I think it kind of maybe, although it was not a national lockdown, it was a regional lockdown. But then you had all regions going simultaneously concurrently in the lockdown. So we actually lost almost close to about 40 days of production. And that means that Q1 performance was very dismal, and it is going to be dismal. But I think, let's say there is certain macro parameters at play. We have got good monsoons. We also are, there is, with this assumption that COVID 3.0 is not going to hit and spoil the party. But let's say we also were looking at a good festive season. Right. There is infrastructure spending which is coming in. But then there is a risk now of shortages of semiconductors, which is globally hitting on this. There's escalations in commodity prices. So I think it's a mixed bag. Very difficult to answer your question that how much potential you're going to look at it. But I think if we actually inch into a double-digit growth, I think it would be very healthy. It would, when I say double-digit, 10 to 15%, anywhere between that, I think it will still be heavy. And of course, we'll have to go sector by sector to see how every sector is going to perform. But I'm talking more on the overall industry percent.
Okay. And as you indicated, this would be again versus last year, which was again a very low base, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But you have to understand that we've had 2 successive years of contractions.
Absolutely.
So I'll take the growth. I hope we're not in a negative territory. I think I'll take the growth.
Exactly. Right. Okay. I mean, since you touched upon the semiconductor point, Deepak, it's a global phenomenon. I think India is obviously hit as well. What do Indian suppliers have to say about it? I mean, we are seeing news of some Indian companies announce that they're going to get into semiconductor production. What is your take on the whole thing?
You have to understand that semiconductors, and when you're looking at semiconductors, understand what are we talking about? We're talking about fab. We're talking about the foundries, right? And I think these are massive investments. Obviously, there is government intent. And if you see the other 3 or 4 big semiconductor companies, 2 of them in Taiwan, 1 in China, 1 in the US, all of them have been actually funded by the government and create the ecosystem. I think ACMA and SIAM has come around with the localization report as well, which gives you an opportunity to say where in at least a localization, which could be the low-hanging fruits, because we are obviously as an industry importing close to about 175,000 crores, right? 1.75 lakh crore of basically worth goods. And there we said that, okay, we will actually try and see 1.34, the top 14 categories in which there could be, if you even look at 25% potential in 5 years, could be a potential of 25 to 30,000 crores of import substitution. But then when you look at semiconductors, I think it needs to be a government intervention. And of course, I mean, say some big players which need to do it, maybe MNCs, maybe domestic, but that's a long-term plan. There's not a short-term plan. All right, that's to gain the nation's competitiveness on the electronics ecosystem. So I think semiconductors will continue to be volatile. I think the only thing what we can do is, we could be very closely aligned with our customers. And, I think someone made the statement, Mr. Hemant Sikka, I think, made a statement in the panel discussion that gone are those days in, just in time planning of 5-6 months, you're planning weekly right now. So it's very difficult to, stable. Mr. Ashwini Gupta as well made that statement that, instead of doing that 6 month, we're doing weekly plans. And, Mr. Sikka also made the statement that you need to really be more transparent on how and where the semiconductor shortages are hitting the Indian industry.
Right, very true. I mean, totally different dynamics that we're dealing with right now. Right. Going back to COVID, a question related to COVID, in terms of the learnings and the takeaways. I mean, first wave and second wave, I think they had a lot of discussions with a number of suppliers post first wave, not as much as many post the second wave. What do you think have been the major learnings? One, and more importantly, how effectively do you think have these learnings been translated into action or execution by the suppliers?
I think for us, the learnings have been truly how do we become more resilient? I think, the whole business continuity, the risk enterprise model, that's completely changed, right? And I think I said that in collaboration, truly, I mean, say in collaboration within the whole ecosystem of our customers, dealers, of our suppliers, of our employees. I think one biggest learning also was that it's not about safety of the product or of our companies, it's actually the safety of people. I think the whole pandemic globally has said that it's people first, right? If our health is there, so I think for us last 2 years, and I hope again the pandemic or this pandemic turns into endemic, and I mean, it really doesn't repeat that severity, but clearly it showed the vulnerabilities of the nation, the vulnerabilities of the industry, and definitely the vulnerabilities of the supply chain at a global level. And I think that's where we have to kind of reconstitute, reset ourselves with a very different mindset that how does basically this whole business risk, the business continuity, when it's at risk, how do we actually, learn and how do we actually go back? And I think there I must compliment the whole ecosystem. Truly it's been resilient and remarkable, including the government support, to supply chain especially. Maybe I think there was not at the consumer end, like direct transfer benefit, where a lot of other economies did that. But at least I think the government ensured that the supply chains for operating, the industry was operating. I think there was a super collaboration between the OEMs and the supply chain partners in making COVID protocols, in making sure that our workforce and the shop floor safe, making sure we collaborated on the vaccination drives, and we continue to do so. So there was immense learning. And I think this whole digital transformation, we are a manufacturing sector, all have digital plans. We all used to talk pre-COVID about Industry 4.0 and all. But I think the COVID actually shook up the industry, made it a wake-up call, because we're like, it's like a human being, right? We all talk about, nice to jog, have to eat healthy. But when you're in heart attack and you're in the emergency room, you actually ensure that you take all these, factors in very seriously. And I think that digitization, that's truly impacted the whole nation as well as our industry. So I think going forward, definitely the learnings should basically sustain, specifically on the collaborative model. And I think we'll continue, again, I'm coming back to the theme that continue to concurrently, have this whole survival, revival, and growth play in this whole era of disruption.
Very interesting. Very well put as well, Deepak. Lots of interesting takeaways. And as you said, resilient is one word. It also made our supply chain, the suppliers, a lot stronger, right? To face challenges and to be more agile.
Well, when you come into this existential threat, I always, get reminded of Charles Darwin. It's basically survival who will survive is the survive, not the strongest, right? Not the fittest. It's the guys who are basically more prone to adapt. And I think that's where the whole industry adapted very quickly with a very, very collaborative workforce. And I think that's where I think going forward in maybe not a pandemic situation, but the disruptive forces will continue to play going forward. And I think there we have to keep on adapting as well.
Right. You spoke about imports, right? How are things on exports, especially after BS6? I think that opened up a lot of new opportunities, new markets as well. How are exports doing, Deepak?
I think first and foremost, and I think that's where Dr. Goenka, kind of referred to, even Mr. Bhargav referred to that. I think we shouldn't be happy with this 20, 30% incremental exports. I think first and foremost, let's understand that we are we are minuscule when it comes to the global value chain. 1.3%, even if I look at a $15 billion export, $1.3 trillion kind of this. And I think that's where is the opportunity for the component sector. And truly, I think the component sector is committed that we should become a net exporter. We've been traditionally and always been actually a net importer, right? And in 2018-19 at peak, when we actually did close to about $15 billion of export, which was the highest, by the way, highest revenue, I think it was $58 billion, but we also did the highest import, which was $17.5 billion. So it was about a $2.5 billion deficit. And today, over the last 2 years, because of probably, I would say, low consumption, reduced demand, the deficit has reduced from a 2.5 billion to $500 million. But I think we need to have a two-pronged strategy. Keep on focusing on the bigger picture to ensure that we basically are doing exports. I think one good thing and good insight I can tell you is 60% or 65% of exports is actually to US and Europe. Hence, I think the quality challenge is definitely overtaken. We have established at the auto component sector that we have world-class quality. We need to move up the higher value chain. We need to ensure that as brand India, as a component sector, we are able to add value to our customers globally, but then also have a very focused effort in localizing. Because if you're not localizing, it would actually also reduce your competitiveness. Because key here for the component sector to survive is keep on having a single-minded focus on enhancing our competitiveness.
Right. Okay. Since we're talking about exports, I think this question was relevant probably soon after the first wave of COVID. We've asked this to a number of suppliers, but since you're wearing the ACMA hat right now, India versus China, how do you think COVID has kind of impacted this entire trade war, if you may call it? Do you think there is an increasing trust or faith on India versus China? What is your take on it?
I think both economies have their own roles to play, and also in the global value chain. Now, let's understand that to compete today on the scale what China has and the way it soars, I think it would not be, I would say, even a fair comparison to talk about India and China. You know, I would say, again, the global value chain, what China has and what India has is very, very different. And I think that's where the opportunity is. We talked about a China plus one strategy, but we have to also understand that the global supply chains will always go to the region which is offering maximum competitiveness. And that's why I come back to the point on India's single-minded focus to enhance the competitiveness. It could be through quality, it could be through cost, it could be through technology, through ecosystem, but we need to keep on doing that. What it has definitely given this pandemic, and specifically, you know, when we talk about China, is I think the world over, OEMs and supply chains have realized how over-dependent we are on one region. And it could be today China, it could be tomorrow Europe, it could be one. And that's where you're actually doing a lot of risk mitigation, in which it throws opportunities to other regions, which is also India, one of them. And India has to compete with other regions in this opportunity. So I think there is definitely export enhancement, but I think we need to do a lot more to focus on how do we keep promoting exports.
Coming to the EV topic, I mean, that's definitely part of every discussion that we're having these days. There was obviously a thought that COVID probably pegged back the EV revolution, at least as far as the Indian market was concerned. That doesn't seem to be the case. We're still seeing new brands come into the market. We're still seeing models come in. We're still seeing demand. What is your outlook on the growth of the e-mobility space in India, maybe short to medium term?
I couldn't have said better as what Mr. Amitabh Khan said today. He said EV is inevitable, right? It is here and it's going to come in. And I think he's definitely given the message to the industry, to all the players, that we must basically embrace this so that we can lead in the EV revolution. I think ACMA has always supported basically all types of technologies. We firmly believe that there is, I think India as a market is basically technology agnostic. There is basically a lot of different technologies, especially future technologies, which will play in India concurrently. It will also give India an opportunity to path its own curve. But you have to understand that there has to be a massive policy support, which seems today that is very clearly towards EV, so that the future mobility can be defined. Also, I think clearly one point, which again I want to make, which Bhargav Saab said yesterday as well as today, is the affordability, right? Auto components competitiveness is primarily driven with a single-minded agenda is how do we meet our customer needs and expectations, right? It's a customer who gives us and defines the quality, delivery, the sustainability, the technology parameters. And I think that's where I think Mr. Bhargav alluded to, that if policymakers also have a single-minded focus that how does our consumer benefit the best, I think he will be able to eventually decide which technology is best for us. But as an auto component supplier, as an auto component fraternity, I think we welcome, including EVs, all technologies. Our only request, and a long-standing request, and I'm sure the government has also supported that request, is that we must create more value addition in India. We must ensure that the industry is given adequate time to localize these technologies in India through various routes. And with that, if you're able to do it, we will have a flourishing ecosystem, and it's not a disruptive ecosystem, it'll be a complementary ecosystem for the industry.
Right. Okay. Since you touched upon localization and since we're talking about EVs, right? What about EV components? How self-sufficient do you think our supply chain is locally to actually cater to electric vehicles that are built within our country?
So I think you have to understand the ecosystem of the EVs, right? If you're talking about the minerals, the raw material which goes into battery making, of course, India is not self-sufficient. But when it comes to components, there are 3 or 4 types, right? There are the mechanical components and there are trends which will go in. There are basically the electrical and the electronic components. And I think there is definitely competence which is building within the framework of the Indian supply chain partners to actually invest for the EVs. Now, there is a conundrum that there is, low scale, and hence, how do we invest, right? And I think this is where, the startups, the risk takers may basically lay more bets. This is where I think the secretary today and yesterday was alluding to that, can we become more risk-taking? And there has to be a collaborative model again to incentivize the industry to take these risks so that we actually have a stable demand and a stable technology roadmap, which basically can ensure that whatever investments we do for localization, especially on new technologies, there's also proper return on investment which is coming through. But I would suggest that, going with EVs, apart from the minerals, when you look at the mechanical parts, you look at the electrical, electronic parts, the motors, I think definitely there is, investments coming in. We have to also understand that the component suppliers need to reinvent ourselves because the EV story will disrupt quite a few of us. And with that, I think wherever there is a green-yellow risk for when EV coming in, I think a lot more of those suppliers would be maybe willing to invest in future technologies and reinvent ourselves.
Very true, very true. And especially for EVs in particular, I think a collaborative approach is very important, right? You need all the stakeholders to come onto the same boat.
Absolutely. And I think I must add here that, ACMA also is in the process to redefine ourselves for the future. We're very happy to say that, ACMA has opened its membership and has now a structured way to engage with new age mobility players. Could be the EV players, could be the players in telematics or the data management, and also most important, the startups. Any advanced technologies with this thing, and you will need more. So there is basically this whole inclusiveness, which ACMA is relooking at, because the component supply chain will be very much now restructured and redefined given these advanced technologies coming in.
Brilliant. Just have one last question for you, Deepak. I mean, one that looks into the future. What do you see as the key growth drivers for the component industry over the next couple of financial years? And how do you think suppliers should be preparing for this growth?
Very interesting question. I think there is no easy answer to it. I think, it will be very different than what we have been used as a traditional model to grow. A traditional model to grow has just been collaborative model, go and engage with your customer and do it. The component industry actually has, let's say, a multi-dimension. We have, of course, the domestic industry. We have an export opportunity. We also have the aftermarket. And all these three are concurrently changing. The domestic industry, as we are going to be expanding and hopefully now in the future will have a stable and a sustainable growth even on the current platforms, the ICE engines. There also is this whole new technology which is coming in. So this, I think, is again a growth opportunity for us to reinvent ourselves. And when you talk about new technologies, there's also an era of localization. Clearly, the industry has set across too. So that will also need a lot of investment, but it also means that you have an opportunity to move, over and beyond the value chain. Exports, we have talked about it. I think clearly there is an export agenda, there is export potential. I think it's up to the industry how well it is poised and focused on building its export competitiveness. And last, I would also like to say on the aftermarket, it's an amazing car park with the scrappage policy coming in, when it takes shape in the future, when basically there will be new mobility solutions, the shared things. I think the car park is nothing but going to expand. And I think that's also going to give an aftermarket. So I think there is, clearly different ways to grow. I think the industry needs to be very careful about being financially prudent and continue again on a single agenda to keep enhancing the competitiveness so that it can explore all growth opportunities. I personally feel that not every component manufacturer will be able to tap all the opportunities. It has to be very clear and focused on what growth opportunities it would want to leverage on.
Yeah, but they have multiple opportunities to choose from, if you may call it so. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Deepak. Thank you so much, for your time and for your insights and for the message for the industry as well. That's how we will portray it as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.